What's up guys, so today I'm going to talk about 5 amazing budget competitive decks that you can play in the October 2021 format. So we're in a really great spot at the moment because the 2021 Megatins have been released this week, which means that a bunch of decks have gotten cheaper, and also in general we're going to see a lot of other less popular strategies get even cheaper, because what's going to happen is people are going to offload their cards into the market, and as a result everything's going to go down a little bit. So it's a pretty nice time to pick up a card if you are pick up cards or a whole deck if you're looking to build a new strategy out. And there's some great strategies at the moment which aren't popular, aren't thought about, or that are getting reprints that you guys can definitely look into picking up, so that you have great strategies moving forward into Christmas. So to start off with, we've got Unchained. Unchained is a really good deck. Now I've had a series on my channel playing Unchained on Dueling Book, and it definitely has a huge amount of potential. So I said in my meta tier list that look, if you're a deck that can main deck things like Macrocosmos and Dimension Shifter, chances are you're going to be doing pretty good in the format, and this is definitely one of those decks. It's got a really effective grindy / floaty playstyle where the idea is you set up a few traps, 1 or 2 Unchained monsters, and then they just keep flowing into each other with destruction based effects and make it very hard to lose field presence. Now, one thing that's really awesome about Unchained as well is, like I said, they can play cards like Dimension Shifter and Macrocosmos because all of their floating effects simply rely on the cards being destroyed. They don't care if they land in the graveyard or if they land in the banish zone. And so this is awesome because that Dimension Shifter literally hits probably about 90% of the decks in the format, and probably about 70 to 80% of Yu-Gi-Oh decks as a whole, which is just really great. So I'm gonna have a kind of build on the screen right now, just an example budget deck list that you guys can go with in this deck. Now there are a few upgrades you can make to make this deck a bit better. The biggest one I would actually say, especially when I was running this, is running 3 Extravagance instead of 3 Desires. Now Extravagance is a little bit more expensive than Desires, but what you can do obviously, and this is going to apply to all the budget decks, is you can start off with some cheaper cards, and then when you get the money you can move up to those more expensive variants. So yeah, definitely 3 extra would be nice. And then also if you do end up with a bit more cash, 3 Ice Dragon's Prison is going to be a lovely card in this deck. Your biggest weakness in Unchained is going to be dealing with those untargetable big monsters like Red Eyes, Dark Dragoon, and so having a card like Ice Dragon's Prison allows you to out those monsters pretty effectively. But yeah, Unchained, definitely a good one to look out for. I didn't put it in my tier list, but I definitely would say that it's potentially rogue, even maybe a low tier 2 deck, because it really does have a huge amount of potential and great matchups against a lot of decks, and if people don't know how to play against it, they will just get wrecked. Moving on, the next deck I would recommend for you guys to try if you're a budget player is going to be Earth Machine. So Earth Machine is a really interesting deck. Now they've gotten a little bit weaker, not so much because of the deck itself, but more to do with the fact that just the format has become more and more grindy and mid-range, and other decks have a good resource game that is just as good as this. But don't let that deter you from picking up this deck. So it's based around 3 archetypes. You've got the Machina archetype, Infinitrack archetype, and the rank 10's Train archetype, and it's kind of like a mishmash of all of these put together to make this weird deck that generally its goal is going to be really simple: end on double anger knuckle, some hand traps in your hand, and some set cards. But it's going to be able to do that every turn and recycle the resources back into this deck over and over again, and it just gives this deck such an insane resource game that makes it really effective sometimes. This is another deck again that if your opponent doesn't know what to hit, they're going to get screwed. Now one of the things that really helps this deck go down in price is Machina Metal Cruncher. So formerly this card was probably one of the more expensive cards in this deck alongside Urgent Schedule. However, in the 2021 Megatins, Machina Metal Cruncher is being reprinted, which is just great news because that's going to help keep this deck even cheaper. So yeah, there's going to be another sample deck list on the screen, and again I think this is a really good deck for teaching you the game. I like decks like this that have a simple strategy but a lot of different ways to execute on that strategy, because you then get a way to learn kind of how to play this deck against different decks, how to play this deck in different scenarios, what kind of win conditions are ideal. You can really tailor make this deck to being ideal for your kind of game plan and your kind of mentality in the game. So yeah, Earth Machine, another really great one. Now we're going to move on to some slightly more competitive decks, and I'll definitely say the next 3 decks, these are all competitive strategies, top 10 decks, so these are really great ones to pick. And the first one is Altergeist. Now Altergeist really interesting. But they've kind of been steadily getting stronger and stronger in each format. Now, Altergeist, one of the biggest things about Altergeist right now is simply the fact that this deck can easily utilize Secret Village of the Spellcasters. Now, as we all know, Imperial Order is a card that is wreaking havoc on the format right now, and every deck pretty much, if they can play it in their main deck, is playing it. Now, Secret Village is just as good, however, this is limited to decks that are focused on spellcasters, and what do you know, Altergeist is all spellcasters, so I really definitely recommend this deck, this format. And then not only that, but they've got just an incredible amount of disruption, monster negation, bouncing, and they also don't really care about spell cards either, so if your opponent is running things like Imperial Order against you, you are not going to care at all. It's also a really simple strategy to get into. Now, one of the things I would definitely say about Altergeist is that its ceiling is hugely raised by two expensive cards, one of them being Infinite Impermanence and one of them being, well, actually, let's say two of them being Pot of Extravagance or Pot of Prosperity. These are both going to massively increase the ceiling of this deck, and so you do want to eventually get to those cards. However, as you can see on the screen, there are some lists you can run, running things like Desires instead and foregoing the Impermanence, and you're still going to have a really good time with this deck. I mean, it's just so good, this format. We're seeing it really take wins at regionals and things, and it's not regional, sorry, but at bigger tournaments we are seeing Altergeist really take those wins, and it's quite surprising to see, to be honest, that this fairly old trap deck is still having a big impact on the meta. And when the release of King of the Sky Prison happens in the TCG, it's definitely going to be a huge buff for this deck as well. So yeah, definitely you look at Altergeist, it's going to be a great one to pick up. Then next we have Prank Kid. So Prank Kid saw a small hit on the list. Now the hit on the list was to Meow Mew, moving it down to 1, which is a bit of a shame for the deck, and it lessened its grind potential a bit. Basically now you have to choose between either having the grind of Meow by shuffling it back with pranks all the time, or using something like a double battle butler effect to completely lock out your opponent. However, in general, Pranks is still going to be a really awesome deck. They're also going to have the ability to utilize the Brave Token engine later on, which is going to massively help them early games. So I mean, Prank Kids is just a really good budget deck to pick up, in my opinion. Another great thing about Prank Kids compared to a lot of the other decks on this list is that it's actually been dominating the format. Like literally, last format, Tri Brigade and Prank Kids were probably the two best decks of the format. The only other deck close to them really was going to be Drytron. But yeah, I mean, even with that, it's definitely still hugely impactful, this format. If you're playing against people with Prank Kids, you're definitely going to be seeing a lot of success. And it's also really good at real life events, simply because Prank Kids is probably one of the best decks in time ever made. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, if you've actually played against it, you'll know that playing against Prank Kids in game 3 is the most traumatizing thing ever, as they burn you for 500, gain 1000 LP on their turn, then they do it again on your turn, and then they summon 16 monsters out so you can't even kill them. I mean, this deck is just really great. Now, as you can see on the screen, most of the Prank Kids cards are pretty cheap. Probably one of the more expensive ones is going to be Prank Kids Place. Another one is going to be that Dodo Doodle Duo. However, you can get away with playing just one place. The Dodo you will need 2, but in spite of that, I still think this is going to be a really good budget option. Maybe a little bit more expensive than the other budget options on this deck, but massively better in terms of how effective it is on the meta. So definitely Prank Kids is another great one to pick up. But my number one, and this is the only one that I'll say is definitively the best budget deck of the format, and another one that is definitely going to be one of the best decks of the format moving into the rest of October and the rest of the year, and that's going to be Virtual World. So Virtual World, I've been playing Virtual World since they released it. I've been playing them even heavier over the last month. This is another deck that I have a great series on my channel running through Virtual World, and this deck is just insane if you're a budget player. I picked up my Virtual World core, and this is everything in the main and the extra deck for under £90 in the UK. I mean, I don't know what the conversion is that for the US. Maybe that's like $120, $130 or something. But I mean, it's just insane value to pick up the entire deck for that. And Virtual World is just such a strong deck. One of the things about Virtual World is that it doesn't really have a bad matchup against any deck. Virtual World tends to do well regardless of the matchup. The main thing that determines whether Virtual World does well or not, more often than not, is just is the deck going to brick? And I'm telling you now, if you don't brick, chances are you're gonna have a good time with that game. Now, Virtual is also one of the few meta decks that saw a buff on the ban list as they got emergency teleport going from 1 to 2, which is really, really lovely, as that provides another starter in the deck. And then also when Burst of Destiny comes out, they can use the level 6 Sword Soul monster in the deck for another negation. I mean, Virtual is definitely a really, really great one to pick up. And I would say whether you're a budget player or not, this is definitely the deck you want to look at. Now, you can slightly improve this deck with some expensive staples like Prosperity, but to be honest, I mean, if you look at the Virtual builds that most people are doing, they aren't even using that. Most people are just running kind of the cheap desires and stuff, because that's all you need to really excel with this deck, and it definitely will serve you well. I mean, we're unlikely to see any major hit on Virtual next list unless it goes super crazy this format. And so I definitely think it's really worth picking up. And what's nice about Virtual is that a lot of the cards, a lot if not all of them, are being reprinted in the megatins as higher rarities. And so what you're going to have is a lot of Virtual players like myself. We're going to be selling off our lower rarity Virtual cards for cheap, and then we're going to be buying those higher rarities to upgrade our cards, which creates a great opportunity for you budget players to come in, buy those cheap Virtual copies, and then start tearing up locals with your new awesome budget deck. But yeah, guys, so those are going to be the 5 budget decks that I definitely would recommend you guys going in. But having said that, like I said, the 2021 reprints mean that there are going to be so many great decks that you guys can pick up if you really want to play. This is one of the nicer times during the format, because you can generally get into Yu-Gi-Oh for quite a cheap price. I'd say 100 to 150 pounds will definitely get you quite nicely in the format at the moment. And so yeah, it's just a really, really, really good time. So make sure you're keeping an eye out on the different forms of buying cards: eBay, TCG Player, Facebook groups. I mean, just keep an eye out for great deals, and yeah, you're definitely going to have a great time. So yeah, thank you all for watching this video, and I'll talk to you all later. Peace.